Blue and black, heart torn out. Insert the needle perpendicular to the epidermis, transversing the epidermis and the full thickness of the dermis, and exiting perpendicular to the epidermis on the opposite side of the wound. You uncover what's beneath my skin. Sutures should be evenly spaced, and tension should be evenly distributed along the suture line. There and back, there is no doubt, your touch is my medicine. The stitch should be wider at its base, dermal side, than at its superficial portion, epidermal side. I'll be okay, 'cause you hear me. Small bites can be used to precisely coat wound edges, and I'll give you all my pieces broken. Large bites can be used to reduce wound tension. In your hands, there is nothing that you can't fix. Proper tension is important to ensure precise wound approximation while preventing tissue strangulation. My heart is frayed, my scars are open. The line of stitches is completed by tying a knot after the last part at the end of the suture line. So put me back together now, stitch by stitch. The knot is tied between the tail end of the suture material where it exits the wound and the loop of the last suture placed. Put me back together now, stitch by stitch. The first knot of a running locked suture is tied as in a traditional running suture and may be locked by passing the needle through the loop preceding it as each stitch is placed. What you say, without words, resuscitates what was numb inside. It consists of a simple interrupted stitch placed wide and deep into the wound edge and a second more superficial interrupted stitch placed closer to the wound edge and in an opposite direction. So repair me, every thread of me, because you are bringing me back to life. The width of the stitch should be increased in proportion to the amount of tension on the wound. I'll be okay, because you heal me. The higher the tension, the wider the stitch. And I'll give you all my pieces broken. The needle penetrates the skin to the level of the deep part of the dermis on one side of the wound, takes a bite in the deep part of the dermis on the opposite side of the wound, without exiting the skin, crosses back to the original side of the wound, and exits the skin. In your hands there is nothing you can't fix. Entry and exit points, therefore, are kept on one side of the wound. My heart is frayed. My scars are open. The first loop is placed approximately 4 to 6 millimeters from the wound edge on the far side and approximately 2 millimeters from the wound edge on the near side. So put me back together, and now stitch by stitch. The suture crosses the suture line and re-enters the skin on the original side at 2 millimeters from the wound edge on the near side. I'm still afraid of falling. Somehow it's taking over me. The loop is completed and the suture exits the skin on the opposite side, 4 to 6 millimeters away from the wound edge on the far side. Don't ever let me let it go. The suture is passed deep in the dermis to the opposite side of the suture line and exits the skin equidistant from the wound edge. There and back, there is no doubt, your touch makes me whole again. The needle re-enters the skin on the same side of the suture line, 5 millimeters to 1 centimeter lateral of the exit point. And I'll give you all my pieces broken. The stitches pass deep to the opposite side of the wound, where it exits the skin and the knot is tied. In your hands, there is nothing that you can't fix. The suture is placed by inserting the needle parallel to the epidermis at the junction of the dermis and the subcutis. My heart is frayed. My scars are open. The needle curves upward and exits the papillary dermis, again parallel to the epidermis. So put me back together now, stitch by stitch. The knot is tied at the base of the wound to minimize the possibility of tissue reaction and extrusion of the knot. Put me back together now, stitch by stitch. The suture must be placed in the mid to deep part of the dermis to prevent the skin from tearing. Put me back together now, stitch by stitch. If tied too tightly, the suture may strangulate the approximated tissue. Put me back together now, stitch by stitch.